If you've ever thought about leaving Windows but felt like Linux just looks different, confusing, or too techy, this video is going to save you weeks of research. Over the past few months, I tried every major Windows-like Linux distro I could find in 2026. I'm talking about installs on real hardware, daily driving them, gaming on them, editing on them, breaking them, fixing them, and genuinely asking myself one question. Could this replace Windows for a normal person? Not for a developer who lives in the terminal. Not for someone who enjoys tweaking configs for fun. I mean, replace Windows for the average user who just wants their PC to work. And I'll be honest, most of them got close. Some was surprisingly good. A few were overhyped, and only one actually made me forget I wasn't on Windows anymore. So here's exactly what happened. First, let me explain how I tested them. I didn't just spin them up in a virtual machine and call it a day. I installed each distro on a secondary SSD in my main desktop. That machine has a mid-range AMD Ryzen CPU, 32 GB reações adversas aos medicamentos, and an NVIDIA GPU. I also tested a couple of them on an older laptop because, let's be real, a lot of people switching from Windows are doing it on aging hardware. I used each distro for at least several days as my primary system. I installed Steam, tried common apps like Discord, VS Code, GIMP, LibreOffice, and I tested file transfers, printer setup, Bluetooth headphones, and even basic stuff like copying files to NTFS drives. Let's start with Zorin OS, specifically Zorin OS 17. Zorin has always marketed itself as the Windows replacement. The first thing you notice when you boot it up is how familiar it feels. The default layout has the taskbar at the bottom, a start menu style launcher on the left, system tray on the right. The icons are clean, modern, and honestly prettier than Windows 10. It feels like a polished version of Windows rather than a cheap imitation. The setup process was smooth. No weird questions, no complicated partition screens unless you choose advanced options. Wi-Fi worked out of the box. NVIDIA drivers were offered during installation. That already puts it ahead of a lot of distros. Using it day-to-day was comfortable. The menu search is fast. File manager works like you'd expect. Settings are centralized and easy to understand. Zorin even has layout switching, so you can make it look like Windows 11, Windows Sechi, or even Mac OS if you want. For someone coming from Windows, that psychological comfort matters more than people admit. But here's where it started to crack slightly. Software availability. Yes, it's Ubuntu based, so you get access to a massive repo. But some newer apps required Flatpak, and sometimes you end up with duplicate entries or weird theme mismatches. Not a deal breaker, but noticeable. Gaming performance was solid. Steam installed easily, Proton worked. Most of my library ran fine. But I did hit one issue with an anti-cheat game that just refused to launch. That's not entirely Zorin's fault, but if we're talking about replacing Windows, these things matter. Still, Zorin OS was very, very close. It felt stable. It felt safe. It felt friendly. Then I moved to Linux Mint, specifically Linux Mint Cinnamon. If you've been around Linux YouTube, you already know Mint is the crowd favorite. And honestly, I get why. Booting into Mint feels like stepping into a parallel universe where Windows 7 never died but kept evolving in a good way. The Cinnamon desktop is extremely intuitive. Bottom panel, start menu, system tray. It just makes sense. No learning curve. Mint feels lightweight but not outdated. The performance on my older laptop was impressive. It was faster than Windows 10 on the same machine. Apps launched quicker, system idle RAM usage was low, and yet it didn't look cheap. Mint's update manager deserves praise. It clearly labels updates by safety level. It doesn't force reboots. It doesn't nag you every 5 seconds. It just works. Installing software through the software manager was straightforward. Flatpak integration is built in and actually well done. I had fewer theme inconsistencies compared to Zorin. Gaming was slightly better here. I don't know if it was just perception, but everything felt smoother. NVIDIA drivers were easy to install via driver manager. But here's the thing. As comfortable as Mint was, it didn't feel modern. It felt reliable, but conservative. If you're coming from Windows 11 and you like that slightly futuristic vibe, Mint can feel a bit dated visually. It's like a perfectly maintained older car. It runs great, but it doesn't wow you. Still, Mint was a serious contender. Next up was KDE-based distros. Because let's be honest, KDE Plasma is the king of Windows site customization. I tried Kubuntu, KDE, Neon, and an Arch-based KDE setup. KDE Plasma 2026 is insanely polished. The desktop effects, the animations, the control center, it's powerful. You can make it look almost identical to Windows 11, down 2 rounded corners and centered taskbar. KDE Neon felt cutting edge. Very up-to-date software. Plasma versions fresh out of the oven, and it showed. It was beautiful. But with that bleeding edge comes occasional instability. I ran into one random panel crash. It had Torah covered. But again, if we're replacing Windows for a normal person, these little hiccups chip away at confidence. Kubuntu felt more stable, but slightly less exciting. It was solid, predictable, but didn't stand out. The Arch-based KDE setup was a performance beast, extremely responsive. But setting it up was not beginner-friendly. Even though Arch has become easier with installers, it still requires a certain mindset. And I can't in good conscience say this replaces Windows. If the setup process alone scares half the audience away, then I tested Windows. Yes, the one that literally tries to clone Windows visually. At first glance, it's almost uncanny. It looks like Windows 11. The icons, the layout, even some UI elements are designed to mimic Windows. It even tries to run some Windows apps via Wine integration by default. And here's my honest reaction. It felt gimmicky. It was impressive, yes, but also slightly off, like a movie set version of Windows. Some elements were pixel perfect. Others felt slightly misaligned or inconsistent. Performance was decent, but I encountered more small glitches here than on Mint or Zorin. I appreciate the effort, but it didn't feel like a mature, long-term daily driver. I also tried Deepin Linux, which has a very polished, almost Mac OS-like design, but can be configured to feel Windows-ish. Deepin's UI is stunning. The control center slides in beautifully. Animations are smooth. It feels premium. But I ran into more compatibility quirks here. Some apps behave strangely. There were occasional translation inconsistencies, and while it's improving, it didn't feel as universally stable as Ubuntu-based options. Then there was Elementary OS. Not really Windows-like, but I tested it because some people claim you can adapt to anything. And honestly, it's too opinionated. It wants to be its own thing, which is fini. But if you're switching from Windows and want familiarity, Elementary's not it. After weeks of testing, reinstalling, benchmarking, gaming, and just living with these systems, it came down to 3 serious contenders. Zorin OS, Linux Mint, and KDE Neon each had strengths. Zorin felt the most designed for switchers. Mint felt the most stable and reliable. KDE Neon felt the most modern and customizable. So which one actually replaced Windows for me? It was Linux Mint, and here's why. It wasn't the flashiest. It wasn't trying to impress me. It just never got in my way. No random crashes, no weird theming bugs, no unexpected behavior. Printers worked, Bluetooth worked, NTFS drives mounted without drama. Gaming worked as well as it possibly can on Linux right now. Mint felt like an appliance. And that's what most people actually want from an operating system. It also has one of the best communities. When I searched for issues, solutions were everywhere. Clear, simple, not buried in obscure forum posts from 2013. The Cinnamon desktop strikes a perfect balance between familiarity and flexibility. You can tweak it if you want, but you don't have to. The performance on older hardware sealed the deal. On that aging laptop, Mint genuinely gave it a second life. It felt faster than Windows 10 ever did on that machine. Now, is it perfect? No. Some Windows-only software still doesn't run perfectly. Adobe products are still a pain. Certain anti-cheat games are still hit or miss, but that's a Linux ecosystem limitation, not Mint specifically. If your workflow is heavily tied to Microsoft Office macros or niche Windows-only software, you're still better off dual boot. But for web browsing, gaming, coding, office work, media consumption, and general daily use, Mint replaced Windows for me without compromise. And here's the biggest test. After finishing my comparisons, I reinstalled Windows on that secondary SSD just to check something. Within 2 days, I was annoyed. The forced updates, the telemetry, the random background processes, the ads in the start menu, the heavier idle RAM usage, going back felt bloated. That's when I realized something important. The goal isn't to find a Linux distro that looks exactly like Windows. The goal is to find one that makes you stop thinking about Windows. Linux Mint did that. Zorin almost did. KDE Neon almost did. But Mint quietly won by being boring in the best possible way. If you're thinking of switching in 2026 and you want something that truly replaces Windows, not just imitates it, start with Mint. If you want more visual polish out of the box, try Zorin. If you love tweaking in modern UI effects, try KDE. But if you just want your computer to turn on work and stay out of your way, Mint is the one. And that's the honest conclusion after trying every Windows Lite Linux distro I could find. If you made it this far, you're probably seriously considering switching. My advice, don't overthink it. Grab a spare USB drive, flash Mint, test it for a week. You might be surprised how little you miss Windows, because in 2026, for the first time, I can confidently say this, Linux isn't just an alternative anymore. For most people, it's a replacement.